12 houses, you know they have kind of a difficult time in life, okay? They have more struggles than people with planets in the first, the fifth, and the ninth house. Those people tend to have life a little bit easier. And it has to do with the nature of the houses. The sixth house is enemies, the eighth house is things we want to get rid of, the 12th house is things we have to get rid of. So essentially, all these houses serve a function. If a person has a lot of planets in the 7th and the 10th house, they're going to be really strongly career-driven and really ambitious, and they want to make a difference in the world. All these chart combinations, and there are many of these, tend to make up the overall picture. Going back and reviewing, what happens is some people, when they're born, so let's say if you're born right now it's April 15th. According to the Indian zodiac, it's essentially the beginning of the solar year. So the sun just entered Aries yesterday in the Indian zodiac. And so the sun's heading towards its exaltation, its best possible place in the whole chart. So it's really vibrant and we're full of energy. So a person who is born around this time of year, around between let's say 6 to 8, will have an Aries sun. And that'll be their rising sign, and that'll be their sun sign, and they'll be full of confidence and kind of ready to face the world and kind of eager to change things. If they were born in, let's say between 8 and 10, Taurus will be their rising sign. And they'll be more materialistic, they'll be driven to spend things because they'll have an exalted sun in the 12th house, they'll be driven to visit foreign countries because that's one of the things the sun in the 12th house does. They'll be very spiritually inclined. If they were born with a Gemini rising, which will be roughly between 10 and 12, they'll have a lot of friends, they'll have a lot of aspirations, they'll have a lot of goals in life, and they'll fulfill those goals in life during sun major planetary periods. A person who is born with a Cancer rising will have a lot of career ambition. They'll want to make a big difference in the world. So that's between 12 and 1 roughly, okay? Or 12 and 2, excuse me, 12 and 2 roughly. And so on and so on, every 2 hours. So essentially the rising sign changes every 2 hours. And whenever you see a person, so actually it's a relatively simple concept. If you know where the sun sign is, April 15th to May 15th, Aries is going to be the sun sign. May 15th to June 15th, Taurus is going to be the sun sign, and so on all the way through the zodiac. So it'll be pushed about a whole 20 days ahead, actually about 27 days ahead of where it is in the Western zodiac, the sun sign starts. And so you'll see different characteristics, and the person's personality will be more judged upon that particular rising sign. So a person who has a Leo rising will want to be king and will want to have all these attributes, especially if they were born around this time of year. They'll want to be in control of things. A person born with Libra rising will have a very bossy wife, okay? Because essentially Libra is in the 7th house, or Libra is the 7th house, but the person will be really interested in 7th house matters, you know, and their 7th house will be Aries, and you'll have an exalted sun in the 7th house. So the relationship partner is going to be the boss in that marriage. It's actually relatively simple. I'm not trying to oversimplify it, but let me go through what the significations of the planets are now, because I'm going to show you a few charts in the next class, and those will be example charts of how these planets work. But the sun overall has to do with the person's ego, their health. So we touched on the signs, and I know we touched on the signs in the first class, but we've touched on them as house representatives in this class, and now we're going to talk about the sun and the planets and where they fit in the chart. So the sun is essentially the person's ego, their soul, their belief in themselves, their strength, okay? So if a person has a strong sun, they'll have a strong ego, they'll be really dynamic, really energetic, they'll go for the gusto, they'll go for the gold, no matter where it is in the chart, okay? If a person has a weak sun, let's say, so it's exalted in Aries, it's debilitated in Libra, they'll essentially let other people make decisions for them. Now this depends on other factors in the chart as well, but they'll be vulnerable, especially in relationships, because the sun's debilitated in Libra, and they'll tend to lose themselves in relationships. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. Not having a big ego is actually a good trait for certain individuals, and they'll be able to compensate for that with other combinations in the chart. So this isn't necessarily a done and done kind of a thing if the sun is weak. But wherever the sun sits in an Indian chart, it's said to burn a hole in the chart. And what they mean by that is essentially that particular house or that particular sign becomes extremely important. And because the sun is such a powerful influence in the chart, it's essentially the single most powerful influence in a Vedic astrology chart, because you have this power. This is the battery of the entire chart. It's what drives the person's desires. The moon is connected with our mind and how we think and how we reflect on things. So the moon is a reflected light of the sun. And the moon goes in phases. So essentially, if the moon is strong, if it's full or nearly full, that's considered good. If it's a bright moon, or if it's just a little bit past full, that's considered very auspicious. A full moon is called a Purnima moon. A weak moon, which is a new moon, is called an Amaskya moon. The Amaskya moon is considered very weak. So if a person has moon right next to the sun in the chart, let's say they're in the same sign or in the same house, or like the moon's behind the sun and the moon's a little bit ahead of the sun, that's considered difficult for the person's mother, because the moon rules the mother. It's considered difficult for the person's thought processes. And what I mean by that is they're not dumb by any stretch of the imagination, but they'll have problems calming down and detaching themselves from situations. So they'll feel a little bit like they have to. The sun dominates the moon in the chart, so they'll feel a need to drive or to prove themselves all the time. If the moon is full, they can detach their mind a little bit from their ego, and they can just go like, well, I understand why this is happening. Let me take a different approach for it on this, and let me reflect on this, and let me see if I can help people out or be more friendly. Usually people with fuller moons tend to be a little bit more social than people with new moons, and they tend to be a little bit, they tend to have an easier time with politics. They tend to have an easier time with getting along with people and with supporting people. It doesn't mean they're more extrovert, actually. That's not the case, but it means they relate better with people. They have an easier time connecting with people. So if the moon is strong, the person has a good mind. Also, the moon tends to, because it reflects the way we think, and because it's connected with mother, it's the first organ that we encounter. The mother is essentially the first person we encounter the world through. And so the sun rules bones, that's the structure of the entire person. And the moon rules blood. So essentially we're tied to our mother through our umbilical cords, which is essentially we're tied to our mother's blood or her nutritional system, right? So essentially, whenever a person shows up with a strong moon, they have a lot of support from the mother. If they show up with a weak moon, they don't have that kind of nurturing or that kind of support. Now again, there are a lot of factors that determine this. There are a lot of individual factors in the chart. So this is a gross oversimplification, doing it just for explanation purposes. But the moon will rule over things like lakes, reservoirs, Sun will rule over things like temples, so things where people go to worship God or do penance. It rules over governments. The moon will rule over things like local governments, essentially things that take care of people, things that nurture people, or things that help people. And the moon is also considered to be a more amicable planet. The moon becomes really important, especially in Vedic astrology, because there's a pattern of nakshatras or lunar mansions that surround the entire zodiac. There are 27 of these, 28 according to some counts in Vedic astrology. And the moon sits in one of these lunar mansions, for approximately 2.5 days. And if we're born under one of these lunar mansions, a planet rules that particular lunar mansion. That planet is the first planet we have to deal with when we're born. So essentially, I can give you a personal example. I was born with moon in the first house, but my moon was ruled by a planet called Rahu, which we'll explain in a second. Now, Rahu gives sleep problems because it was in the 12th house from my moon, and it also can give seizures and those kinds of difficulties. So I was plagued by seizures when I was born, and those didn't go away. Those were essentially became basically a permanent part of my nature. The next planet in line was Jupiter, then Saturn, then Mercury, then Ketu, then Venus, then Sun, then Moon, then Mars, and all the way back to Rahu. So these major planetary periods, or Mahadashas, Mahadasha, those are essentially started from the moon. There are other systems of Mahadashas which are different, which are started from other places, but the most important ones are started from the moon. And there are several of these, but the one I'm using is called Vimshotri Mahadasha, and it's a 120-year period. And I know what you're thinking. We don't all live for 120 years, but the ideal lifespan for a human being is supposed to be 120 years. So we're getting up there slowly but surely. The next planet in importance is Mars. And Mars is essentially connected with, so Sun is father, Moon is mother, Mars is siblings. So you're seeing kind of a parallel pattern to what we have in the house. Mars is siblings, it's brothers and sisters. And it's also connected with our drive or our ambition in life. So if a person has a strong Mars, they're going to be really independent and really self-sufficient and really not rely on anybody else. The Sun may order other people what to do, but Mars just turns around and says, I'm going to do it myself. And people with strong Mars will tend to be solo acts, or they may not even need to get into marriages, or they'll have some difficulties in marriages. But basically, a person with a strong Mars will be attracted to athletics, they'll be attracted to the competitive worlds like law or politics. They'll want to compete, they'll want to be actively competing all the time. They'll also be very logical. Mars is a very logical planet. It's also a very literal planet. So if you say Mars, if you say to somebody with a strong Mars, do this, it's done before you can stop them. And so you have to be very careful in terms of what you say. If any of you have been around lawyers, you'll know they'll cross-examine you, no pun intended, they'll cross-examine you in terms of what you mean. They'll want the exact meaning of the word you use. So those are people with a strong Mars. The next planet in sequence is Mercury. Now Mercury has a bit to do with education, so it's a bit fourth house related, but it also has to do with expression or speech. So people with a strong Mercury are considered to be very witty, very clever in speech, very talkative. They have very good qualities about them. They're considered very attractive, very social. But for some people, they can appear to be a little bit flirtatious or a little bit frivolous. And But Mercury, people with strong Mercuries tend to be extremely intelligent. They can figure the ins and outs of every argument. They can figure the ins and outs of every choice they make. And sometimes they get overwhelmed by these choices, but they'll often have like all the facts in front of them. And I think one of the things about Mercury is there are planets which are natural benefics and natural malefics. We haven't gotten to the ones that are unqualified, I believe, benefic planets, but Moon is a qualified benefic. So if the Moon is waxing or it's close to full or a little past full, it's considered benefic. If it's a dark moon, it's considered somewhat malefic or somewhat difficult. The Sun is called a Krura planet, which means it's cruel, it's not bad, but it's a harsh taskmaster. Mars is considered a malefic planet because it can be destructive. So Mars causes car accidents, and we'll talk about certain other things in a second. It can cause fires, those kinds of things. Mercury is considered to be good by itself or good with other benefics like Jupiter and Venus or a waxing moon, but bad with bad planets. So if it's with Saturn or the Sun, it's considered a difficult planet. And the reason for that is because Mercury tends to be a very malleable planet. It's like a teenager who will essentially hang out with a certain crowd, and if it's a good crowd, it'll go with the good crowd and pick up their traits. If it's a bad crowd, it'll start smoking, hanging out on street corners, those kinds of things. So essentially Mercury itself is kind of a neutral planet, but on its own is considered good, okay? Mercury, as I'm speaking with you right now, is in its worst possible position. It's debilitated, so it's sort of a little bit scattershot right now. And you'll find people over the next few weeks trying to do a lot of different tasks at once. They'll largely succeed, but it is kind of a difficult time to get things solid and get communications, especially online. All right, the next planet in sequence is Jupiter, which has to do with wisdom. So wisdom, intelligence, good guidance, so it's sort of like a fifth house surrogate. And it connects with Mercury's a third and a sixth house surrogate. So essentially